Kingdom of Men, Chapter 9, Punishment. KaLeah woke up in an unfamiliar bed. She was dizzy, and even though the pain was still there, it wasn't as bad as it had been. Her entire abdomen was wrapped in thick white bandages. Her blood-stained tunic was pushed up over the top of the bandages. KaLeah groaned and looked away. There were other beds in the room, all with wounded men crying out, groaning, or silently staring blankly at nothing. Women in long, dark gray tunics ran from bed to bed, taking water and bandages, calling out to one another with concern or orders. She had no idea where she was within the castle, never having seen the room before. There appeared to be no windows, so she assumed she was underground. Long troughs of oil were lit all along the outer edges of the room, and lanterns dotted each bedside table down rows and rows of beds. She tried to sit up, but the pain forced her back down quickly. With a flash, everything came rushing back. Lamone, the group of men who had cornered and stabbed her, Nicolot lifting her off the ground, and tracking the assassin to Amira's room. Spirits, she thought. I need to get to Amira. Nurse, KaLeah yelled. She tried to move again, gritting her teeth against the pain. The nurse, Dory, came into sight, scrambling around a nearby bed. Her short gray hair was matted down with sweat, and her tunic was covered in blood. She crinkled up her nose and narrowed her eyes at KaLeah. "Ah, so you finally awake?" Dory said, putting the back of her hand to KaLeah's forehead. "Just thought you'd sleep right through this battle, huh? Oh, but not before you go and get yourself nearly killed. Lucky that captain brought you in before you bled to death." "Captain?" KaLeah asked, suddenly caught off guard. "Yes, handsome young blonde one. And where's the princess? Leave her to her own devices in all this mess? Or did you go and get her hurt too? Where's Amira? We got nurses looking everywhere, but no one has dared tell the king yet. We were hoping you'd come too first." "She's fine," KaLeah said, struggling against the pain to get out of bed. Dory obviously wasn't going to be a lot of help. "I need to get to her." "Darn right you do," Dory said. She reached out and lifted KaLeah out of the bed in one sweep with a strength that surprised KaLeah. KaLeah's feet hurt when they thudded against the floor. Stars filtered into her sight again, and she had to fight the urge to pass out. Once the room came back into focus, KaLeah used Dory as a crutch. "Get my sword," KaLeah said. "I need you to carry it for me." Dory didn't protest. She grabbed KaLeah's sword in her right hand while supporting KaLeah with her left arm. And together, they slowly made their way out of the room. The hallways were littered with wounded men, leaning against walls or napping on the floor. Blood was everywhere on the lower levels. The wounded men had dragged themselves in, leaving streaks, drops, and sometimes puddles of blood along the way. The women saw fewer and fewer injured men as they moved upwards through the castle toward the royal wing. It was slow going, and they eventually made it to the hallway that led to Amira's room. The assassin was still lying dead on the floor. Dory handed the sword to KaLeah, then pushed open her bedroom door, since Amira's was still locked. KaLeah directed her to the tapestry hanging on the wall. "Pull that aside and you'll see a door behind it that leads to Amira's room." Dory set KaLeah's sword down and did as she was told, letting out a small breath as the door came into view. "I always assumed but never knew for sure," Dory mumbled to herself as she started to pull the door open. "They really are everywhere, huh?" They walked into Amira's room and then to the princess's hidden entrance to her own secret passageway. The women peered into the dark hallway. The blankets and pillows were piled up there, but no child princess. Dory bent down to rummage through the bedding just to be sure. "Amira?" But the dread in KaLeah's stomach told her what she already knew. Amira was not in the secret passageway. Her heart began to pick up speed, and she hoped that her eyes were just misleading her. "Amira must be in there," she thought. "Amira, come out, it's KaLeah," she said again. Dory walked further into the passageway. She called loudly for Amira, and both women waited without breathing. "I don't see a princess in there, Miss Favor," Dory said with disdain. KaLeah let out an aggravated shout. Ugh. She didn't care if Dory scolded her. KaLeah was livid. She could feel adrenaline begin to burn through her veins. KaLeah turned as fast as she could, pain still stabbing both sides, and went into the passageway, using the walls to support herself. Her pain was beginning to slowly abate, though, as her adrenaline and anger increased. "I told her to stay put." "Are you crazy?" Dory said with a huff. "Have you ever known a child do what it's told?" "I always did what I was told," KaLeah shouted in defense. She never would have dreamed of disobeying her father. And even though she had few dealings with adults in her village, she always obeyed them as well. "Someone could have taken her," Dory said in a whisper. KaLeah didn't want to even acknowledge that thought, knowing that if that was true, it was all her fault. She put one arm on each wall and started calling out for the princess, hoping that Amira had just crawled off deeper into the secret hallways. Dory grabbed KaLeah's sword, a lantern from beside the bed, and followed her into the passageway. KaLeah was grateful for Dory's frightened silence. She strained to hear and see anything in the darkness. She headed in the direction of her own room first. After checking through the wardrobe that the room was still empty, she continued in the same direction. It was the direction that the lit candles had taken her the first night she was introduced to the secret tunnels. The two walked silently but as quickly as they could, following the light of the lantern that Dory held. They came to a fork. To the left, they could see nothing, but to the right, there seemed to be a faint light shining back at them. "This way," KaLeah said, and went toward the speck of light. When they got to the wall, Dory held up the lantern, and KaLeah could see a small crack in the stone. She pushed against the tunnel wall, and a secret door swung open, revealing shelves filled with books, ornately carved tables, chairs, and serving counters. They both had to squint against the sudden onslaught of candlelight. "Amira!" KaLeah yelled, shoving through the door and into the library. She grimaced in pain but tried to ignore it. There was no response, but KaLeah heard faint sounds and followed them to a row of windows lining the top of the library. The light flickering all around her played with her vision, but she crept closer until she confirmed that one of the windows was indeed open. Closer now, she could hear sounds of metal swords clashing and men's voices drifting in through the window. KaLeah noted that the sounds were fewer and farther between than they had been earlier. She hoped that meant the battle was coming to an end, and even more, that they had won. The window was too small and too high up for anyone to climb through. She wondered how it had been opened and thought about Lamone trying to smuggle in another assassin. Dory crept up behind KaLeah to investigate. "You think she tried to see what was going on?" Dory asked. KaLeah saw a chair on its side conveniently located under the window. "See and hear the battle, yes," KaLeah said, shaking her head. "She might be the next closest window. Come on." KaLeah headed to the library door, no longer using Dory as a crutch since adrenaline was driving her forward. "Dory, I can take my sword now." Dory handed the sword over, and KaLeah felt both a sudden pain from the weight and a comfort. "Where's the nearest window?" Dory asked. "Not on the first floor, surely." "No, but there's a door," KaLeah thought. Would Amira have gone to a door? As if in answer to her question, KaLeah reached a staircase down to the main hall. The main hall would lead to the front doors of the castle. KaLeah bit back the pain as she ran through the castle to the main doors. She could hear Dory panting behind her. KaLeah reached the main hall and stopped. Amira was lying face down on the marble floor, her tiny body bent awkwardly with her light blonde hair fanned out around her head. There was an Extellan soldier standing over Amira. The man pulled his giant blood-soaked sword up over his head with both arms. "No!" KaLeah screamed. She ran at the man with her sword drawn. The Extellan was distracted for a moment. KaLeah stopped in front of him and then spun to the side to strike him. The sword must have been too heavy for him, because he had trouble moving fast enough to block her blows. His face was hidden behind a dark beard, but she could see the frustration in his beady eyes. She had interrupted his kill. Then he started to smile, and goosebumps climbed up her spine. Instantly, she knew Amira was dead, and it was all her fault for leaving the child alone. KaLeah stared at the Extellan's long, bearded grin, and the room began to spin. She felt sick, weak. She couldn't lift her sword. The man started to move toward KaLeah, ignoring the body heaped on the floor behind him. KaLeah just stared, unmoving. Everything seemed to be pushing the Extellan fighter to her, but she had no will to move. The princess was gone. She had failed because she hadn't even tried. Protecting the princess wasn't what she wanted to do, and now she would pay the ultimate price. Then she heard a low moan, so low it didn't seem human, more like a vibration against the floor. Amira was alive, breathing, and in danger. KaLeah snapped to attention and brought her sword up in front of her. The soldier wasn't swayed by her sudden awakening. He grinned wider and advanced upon her quickly, raising his sword. KaLeah met his metal with hers. She felt pure hatred for the man and walked into every blow, pushing him away from Amira and toward the castle entrance. KaLeah drove him through the open doors and out into the night air. The sickly, sour smell of men's sweat penetrated her nostrils. The putrid smell of death and metallic blood proved to be a toxic mix, and KaLeah began to feel nauseous again. She could hear Dory running across the floor behind her to Amira. KaLeah fought the urge to turn back and check on the princess. Her hesitation almost cost KaLeah her life. The Extellan swung his sword and missed KaLeah's throat by a fingernail's width. Whatever medicine she had been given earlier was beginning to wear off, and the pain in KaLeah's side was causing her arm to feel weak. For a moment, she wanted to stop, to take a break, or to just let the warrior win so she could rest. She began hearing low rumblings replacing the noise around her. The rumblings turned to growls, and the growls began to sound like whispers. Fight. Kill. The words appeared in her mind, and a new energy surged through her body. The pain completely vanished, as if a heavy blanket had been placed on her to block it out. KaLeah now had a clear head and specific objective: kill the Extellan soldier before her, return to the entrance hall, and take Princess Amira to safety. The Extellan stood before her in his black and purple uniform, disheveled hair, and his face marred by blood, sweat, and dirt. Like all the other men KaLeah had taken out, he never once looked worried. He grinned and countered every blow. Then he drove in tighter and stronger, causing her to take a step back. His false sense of confidence caused him to pause long enough for KaLeah to lunge and get her sword into a space between his armor, pushing her sword through his side. He fell with the grin still on his face. KaLeah quickly scanned the area. She was clear for an escape. She turned and ran back into the castle, tucked her sword under her arm, then used both hands to close the massive wooden doors against the battle. "I don't understand why you're so angry with me, KaLeah," Amira said in a faint whisper. They were back in Amira's room, and the princess was sitting on a small, tufted couch. KaLeah didn't respond. She stood by the window, clutching her sides, and watched the sun rise over the corpses. It had been the longest night of her life, and she needed time to process. However, she wasn't going to leave the little girl's side after what had happened, at least not until she received an all-clear message from someone in charge. Fight. Kill. She had heard the words so clearly, and yet they had not been hers. The words being preceded by an animalistic growl made her wonder if she had thought those words at all. She remembered the dragon from the woods and how it had seemed to speak to her through her mind. But that hadn't really happened, had it? KaLeah had convinced herself that the entire thing had been a dream. Her father left, angry that she had not brought home a kill. He left, and she has been searching for him ever since. Had been, she reminded herself. With a princess like this, putting her life in danger, making herself available for assassins and murderers all the time, It was no wonder they wanted to put a guard on her. But why does it have to be me? KaLeah wondered. This isn't my life. I shouldn't be here. You should have stayed in your room, KaLeah mumbled, afraid to unleash her true anger. It would have been safer. You could have been killed. She gritted her teeth together to keep from yelling. The princess said nothing, and KaLeah refused to look at her. You have been up all night, KaLeah said. Why don't you try to get some rest? The curtains in your bedchamber are closed, and I've secured the passageway door. I will stand watch here while you sleep. Go on now. Although only a bodyguard, she was still older and did not want to argue with a child. Luckily, the princess did not protest. KaLeah kept watching out of the window. Nurses were checking the bodies for anyone still alive, while soldiers were carrying off anyone who was not. She was relieved that she did not see the prince or Hilip among them. She heard a soft but rapid knock against the door in her room and realized that the secret door must be cracked open. She slipped into her room through the opening behind the tapestry. Who's there? Captain David, miss. She unbolted and opened the door. The man was brushing away bloody strands of hair back from where it was stuck to his sweaty face. His clothing was disheveled, torn in places, but he didn't look injured. His eyes went from hers to the bulk of her bandaged abdomen. I wanted to make sure, he started, then bowed slightly, catching himself. Pardon me, favor KaLeah, but I wanted to make sure you were all right. I received a report that you'd been injured. Yes, sir, thank you for your concern. The princess is resting now. He shifted from one leg to the other, looking at her while she spoke, but away from her when he replied. I received reports of the assassination attempt, and Prince Nicolot has claimed that Lamon was the one who let the assassin into the castle. He turned his eyes to the blood-stained carpet outside of Amira's door. However, it seems you managed to kill him before he could get to her. He sounded concerned and remorseful. I followed and killed the would-be assassin, yes. I'm so sorry that you had to do that, miss, he said, struggling to keep his eyes on her. I should have kept the men stationed outside these rooms. Next time they will have orders, I swear. Hopefully there is no next time, KaLeah said, smiling at this man's chivalrous and protective gesture. She wasn't used to interacting with men like him. Prince Nicolot reminded her of her father. He was stoic, hard to read, and cryptic about his feelings. There was a deep, brooding mystery to them that perplexed KaLeah. This captain, however, carried his heart on his shoulder and his concern in his eyes. She wondered for a moment if they could be friends. No, he's only here checking on me because it's his job, and he's covering up for a perceived mistake, she told herself. We may have to go on the offensive now, Captain Davin continued. So, yes, hopefully, we can avoid a next time, of course. She cocked her head. Is he lingering? Thank you for checking on us, she said, thinking maybe he was waiting for a dismissal. My pleasure, he said, bowing slightly again. I am pleased that you are all right. I'll leave you to rest, may I? Hilip leaned forward in her doorway, eyes on her, with his hand extended. She looked down at his calloused fingers, confused for a moment, before realizing he meant to close her door for her. She took a small step back into the room. Of course, she said, feeling embarrassed. Rest well, he said, faintly, and closed the door. KaLeah returned to the princess's room and sat beside her damaged door. Guards had returned to stand outside of it, but promised not to repair the door until after the princess had rested. KaLeah heard updates through the door as soldiers spread word throughout the castle. Bellerone's soldiers had successfully defended the castle, and the remaining Extellans had been imprisoned in the holding cells in the lowest part of the castle. Amira called the dungeon the bottom, which KaLeah assumed made Amira more comfortable. Neither of them had ever been down there, but she assumed it was filled with starving, tortured enemies whose arms were bolted to the walls, and they were forced to fight rats over the right to drink muddy water. Exactly what those Extellans deserve, KaLeah mused. Suddenly, a new thought entered her mind. She could not ignore the fact that word of her leaving Amira, of Amira almost being killed, was surely going to reach the king. How long before I am taken down to the dungeons? She wondered. Would the king do that to me? Would he torture me? Punish me? Her initial justification of joining the fight as a warrior to protect the princess didn't quite hold water, since the princess had almost made it all the way out into the battle. KaLeah knew that none of this would have happened if she had just stayed in the secret passageway with Amira. Even if the assassin had found them, she could have killed him there and not had to chance losing him through the darkness on his way to her room. She knew she had made a mistake. Even though she had the skill and the will to fight, she had wanted to go into the battle more than she wanted to protect the princess. She pulled her legs in under her chin and hugged her knees, feeling guilty. I went looking for a fight and left her exposed to danger, KaLeah said to her knees. She closed her eyes tightly, tight against the realization that she had been wrong, tight against the reality that the princess could have been killed, tight against the impending punishment. She opened her eyes and took in a deep breath, sitting with her guilt for what felt like hours. Finally, she stood up, squirming at the pain that shot through her sides, but knowing that she deserved the pain, and slowly walked to Amira's bedchamber. She stood at the foot of the bed, leaning into a bedpost. "Princess," she said, "I'm sorry that I abandoned you during the attack. I should have stayed by your side. I'm truly sorry." She could not see anything within the darkness of the room, but the princess's soft voice came through. "I forgive you, my friend. Thank you for saving me." KaLeah bowed her head and backed out of the room as her eyes began to sting with tears. She stood silently at the window, watching the cleanup activity below, while the sun slowly rose higher in the sky. She had grown used to the throbbing ache in her side and wondered absently if she should return to the infirmary and have Dory rewrap her wound with fresh bandages. There was a knock at the door, and for a moment she wondered if Dory had come to do just that. "Who's there?" KaLeah called out. "The king requests the presence of the royal daughter and favor KaLeah immediately," said a soldier's deep voice. This is it, KaLeah realized. She had fought in a battle she wasn't supposed to fight in, lost the princess, and almost gotten them both killed. She wanted to run to the secret passageway and follow it out of the castle. She wondered how far she could run before they caught up with her. She considered briefly cutting her hair, pretending to be a boy, and hiding out in a village somewhere beyond the farmlands. Princess Amira emerged from her room, smoothing down the front of a light green tunic. "Are you ready?" she asked KaLeah, who was still standing dazed and ashen-faced in front of the window. "I look guilty," she said, motioning to her still dirty and blood-stained tunic. "Go change, and I will stall," Amira said. KaLeah went through the connecting doors to her room and quickly changed into a clean tunic and pants. She found a new pair of boots and slipped them on, cringing at the pain when she bent over to tie them. When she returned, she found the princess in the doorway speaking to a soldier. She joined them, and they followed him through the castle. KaLeah assumed they were headed to the king's study. Each step was painful as she tried to keep up with the guards' fast pace. The hallway leading to the study was lined with soldiers in their red and white uniforms. The men watched the girls quietly as they passed. KaLeah felt no sense of camaraderie with any of them, which disappointed her. She would be reprimanded for fighting bravely, unlike these men, who would be celebrated. The girls entered the king's study. There were captains and a few soldiers in the room, and Prince Nicolot and Limon standing in front of the king's desk. Where Nicolot's face, hands, and armor were splattered with blood, it was obvious that Prince Bilex had only seen action from safely inside the castle. The circles under the king's eyes were more concave than she'd ever seen them. His eyes were bloodshot, and his brows were pulled close together, driving more wrinkles across his forehead. His uniform was similar to the others, but with a few embellishments, like silver buckles and what looked like small dragon wings sewn across the tops of the shoulders. Amira kept walking to meet her father, but KaLeah lingered in the doorway. Nicolette and Lamone were both standing with their backs to her, Lamone's hands tied behind him, and a soldier standing with one hand clamped down on his shoulder. Hatred bubbled up inside her at seeing him, and she wanted to run full speed at Lamone, knock him down, and hurt him. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, bit the inside of her cheek to keep her mouth shut, and walked like a soldier to stand beside Amira. She noticed more captains and soldiers standing along the back of the room. One was Captain Davin. She could feel his and Nicolette's eyes on her as she crossed the room. Nicolette has left off the story with you, favor KaLeah, King Erasus said, still very loud for how exhausted he appeared. What happened when you followed Lamone around the side of the castle as Nicolette had instructed? As Nicolette had instructed? What was she, Nicolette's servant? She fought back the urge to glare at Nicolette and kept looking at King Erasus. This is about Lamone's treachery, she realized, not her. She let out a breath she had been holding. Lamone conversed with an Extellan assassin, Your Majesty, KaLeah said. Lamone showed the assassin a secret entrance. I followed the assassin to just outside the princess's chambers. Then I killed the assassin after he tried to kick in her chamber doors. Your Majesty. Lamone? The king bellowed, making everyone except for the soldiers jump. Have you any argument for your life? His words reverberated throughout the room. KaLeah moved her head slightly so she could look at Lamone without being noticed. He was shaking and sweating. The cruel sneers KaLeah was used to seeing on Lamone's face had melted away, leaving him looking young and pitiful. Lamone tried to struggle against the ropes on his hands and took a step toward the king. The soldier next to him held him back. Nicolette showed me the passage door, Lamone said. It was his plan. He's always helped me. King Erasus pushed himself away from his desk and stood up. His eyes were like coal. How dare you? The king began. Lamone interrupted, his voice raised louder. How else would I have known about the entrance? How else would I have known they were on the lawns the day Amira was kidnapped and for the second attempt? The king shot an angry glance at Nicolette, who looked bewildered. How did he know about the entrance, Nicolette? The king asked. Nicolette's eyes went wide, and his mouth dropped open. Then he quickly recovered, narrowed his eyes at Lamone, stood up straight, and turned to address his father. Lamone has always been my faithful friend, Nicolette said. If he is proven to be traitorous, I never had any inclination. Perhaps he spied on me, and he must have used me when I told him I was going to invite my sister riding with me. Nicolette put a lot of emphasis on the word used and met his father's gaze straight on. KaLeah felt the hatred spilling from Nicolette and thought that he would kill Lamone right then and there if his father ordered it. The king lowered his head and rested his palms on his desk. After a long pause, he straightened back up and looked at two of his soldiers. Lamone's traitorous actions will be punished, King Erasus said. He cannot be left alive to try to harm any of my children again. He is a threat to Bellerogne. Then to Lamone he said, King Sarzo sent you, of course. You are his spy. Lamone gulped, but said nothing. Execute him immediately, and send some men to permanently seal that entrance to the castle. The soldiers moved to grab Lamone from both sides. They lifted his thin body off the ground and began to carry him out of the room. Lamone kicked and yelled furiously. Nicolette is the traitor, Lamone screamed. He has been working with King Sarzo from the beginning. It was Nicolette. He set up everything. Everything. Nick! The soldiers pulled Lamone out of the room, but they could all hear his voice in the hall, calling out for Nicolette over and over. The room grew quiet, and everyone turned back to the king. KaLeah noticed that he was sweating, and he rubbed the space between his uniform and his neck as if he was being choked. Now, King Oasis said, I need to speak to my children alone. KaLeah, you may stay, but everyone else must leave. The soldiers marched out, and the king sat down in the large chair behind his desk, letting out a long sigh. He looked up at KaLeah first. I am glad you tracked the assassin, he said slowly, and so much more quietly that KaLeah leaned slightly forward. I am glad you discovered Lamon to be a traitor. But what were you doing out on the battlefield? I know you left Amira alone, KaLeah. I know she was almost killed because of you. And though she may never be a queen, her survival is important for the people of Belleron. Her survival is important to me. He jabbed his finger to his chest, and she noticed his eyes moisten ever so slightly. Guilt spun inside her stomach and sent bile up her throat. She swallowed it down, trying not to make any facial expression as she held his eye contact. The only reason I do not send you to Lamon's fate is that you have saved Amira's life in the past, and I believe that you now know how. You must always be by her side to save her life, to keep her from any danger, any harm. Amira, if anything had happened to you. He broke off and took another breath. He pushed back in his chair and cleared his throat of the fear and sadness. KaLeah saw his body stiffen as anger began to creep back in. You will marry and become part of the Favor families, have children, and continue the Belleron legacy. I am disappointed in both of you. I want you both to listen very carefully. Amira, you will begin to act like a lady of the court. You will spend your days in the library reading and studying about what it means to be a wife of a favor. You will grow up and find a husband, leave the castle, and live in the community with KaLeah as your midwife and nurse. She will take care of your children while you take care of your husband. My child, you are a princess but not a queen. Until you fulfill your duties as a wife to be a member of this court, you owe your life to your king, be it me or one of your brothers. Do I make myself clear, ladies? KaLeah felt like her lungs hadn't received air in days. They began to hurt, and the pain blended into the aching in her sides. She had grown up in a village where they had had their customs, but she had only known her father as her leader. Nobody ruled the village, and his was the only command she obeyed. Now, sitting in front of her king, listening to him commanding her to dedicate her life to his daughter, both confused and infuriated her. Who is this man to tell me how to live the rest of my life? And yet, she knew, as truly as she'd always known, to obey her own father no matter what, that there was great risk in disobedience. Her fear and her pride battled inside of her, sending bumps along her skin, standing her arm hairs on end. Yes, father, Princess Amira's soft reply snapped KaLeah back to reality. This was a king, and a king could have you killed. Although she did not want to be a servant for the rest of her life, she wanted to stay alive. Staying alive would at least buy her time to escape. It would give her the chance to fight back. She let the air rush back into her lungs, and a little too loudly she said, Yes, your majesty. You may both go, the king said. KaLeah stood, and without looking at Prince Nicolot or Captain Davin, she followed Amira and two guards back to the princess's chambers in a fog. The king's words rang in her head. KaLeah will be your midwife and nurse. KaLeah will raise your children. KaLeah will be your servant until the day you die. She realized that she was lucky to still be breathing, but the feeling of relief never came. The joy of not being taken to the dungeon to sleep with rats until the day of execution seemed so dim compared to the utter weight of facing a lifetime of servitude. It seemed like only yesterday she was waking up in her own village, hunting her own woods, and ending the days eating by her own fire. She had never planned to marry, never planned to leave that hut or her father's side. But here she was, being handed a life she did not want, and being told she would never have her own life again. In that moment, she wondered if her punishment was worse than death. KaLeah paced her room for hours. Her eyes burned from being open for too long. She stopped moving only when Dory came to replace her bloody bandages and forced her to wash off in the tub. "Neither of you are in any shape to be seen," Dory said. "Falere and I will bring you both your dinners this evening." KaLeah kept pacing, even after the food had arrived. She walked while eating, her body too starved to ignore the smells of baked meat, vegetables, and potatoes. The sun had set by the time she finished, and Amira had been washed and dressed for bed by the nurses. Although the man in the castle foyer had knocked her down, Amira had not been injured. The nurses still fretted over her and made sure that her bath had been extra warm, the towels soft and fresh. Dory tucked her in with all the loving care of a mother, and both ladies left past the guards, who closed the repaired doors behind them. "Princess," KaLeah said quietly from the threshold of her bedchamber. "Yes? Are you all right?" The young girl sighed. "I am. I'm very tired. I wonder who I'm going to marry. Whoever it is, I'm glad that you'll be with me." KaLeah closed her eyes tightly and clenched her fists. "It isn't fair," she thought. "None of this is fair." "I will be in my bedchamber if you need me. Good night." She turned and headed to her room without waiting for a response. Responding to the princess's needs was the last thing she wanted to do. The castle grounds were dark. Guards, some with lanterns and some without, patrolled the courtyard outside her window. Just the other night, she was looking out the same window, ready to go meet the prince, with no idea about what was going to happen. Thoughts of the prince filled KaLeah's mind. She pictured the chiseled features of his face, and she was instantly transported back to the ballroom, feeling the nervous currents of energy flowing through her body, the rush she'd experienced when his lips had touched hers. She wanted to see him, to talk to him, and her cheeks grew hotter just thinking of kissing him again. Her mind started to turn. "No, I hate Nick a lot," she thought. "Why do I want to see him?" But something had changed since the kiss in the ballroom. It was as if whatever wall she had been trying to build had crumbled at her feet. He really was a beautiful man, however mysterious. Kissing him had sparked a feeling within her she'd never known before. She hadn't been interested in any of the boys back in her village. Growing up with them, they all felt like unwanted brothers. She wanted to be near Nicolot. She worried that she was on the verge of losing him, and that made her want to see him even more. Did he care that she would be tied to his sister for the rest of their lives? What if my life was tied to his instead, she wondered. Perhaps if he decided that he loved her and wanted to marry her, then his father would release her from servitude. She was a favor, after all, and the royals married favors. It wasn't as if she was some poor village girl anymore. Could this be her way out? Every woman had to get married eventually anyway. So, at least if she were married to a prince, she could have the money and the freedom to go wherever she desired with guards at her side. He had told her that the king's plan was to take Exteli and put Nicolot on the throne. She could be his queen and send her own soldiers to search for her father. She had never dreamed of being in such a position, but she hadn't dreamed of being the personal bodyguard to the princess either. "Yes, this is my solution," she decided. It was sensible. If she had to be a servant, she would prefer being a wife over a playmate. If this was the only way to get resources to find her father, then she was willing to make the sacrifice. She walked over to a small desk to get a pen and paper. Should she admit to needing his company? What if her letter was read by someone else? She decided to keep it brief. "Please, meet me in the ballroom tomorrow at midnight," she wrote. She signed the letter with the word midnight instead of her name. KaLeah folded the letter and sealed it with candle wax. Hot wax dripped onto her finger, but the sting was nothing. She watched the wax dry and then peeled it off. She asked one of the guards outside Amira's door to deliver her message and was pleasantly surprised by how easily he complied. Finding the solution and sending the note made her feel as if she had made some progress and wasn't as locked into her fate as it appeared. She relaxed and kicked off her boots, preparing to slip into a night tunic. There was a knock at her door. Nicolot? She went to the door and opened it, a wide, expectant smile on her lips. Hillip was standing there. He greeted her with a nervous smile. He had changed into clean clothes and washed the blood from his face and hands. "Good evening, favorite KaLeah," he said. Her smile slipped for a moment in disappointment, but she recovered it quickly. "Captain? If you're not too tired, I'd like to show you through some of the passageways." She was exhausted, but after having to use so many of the secret corridors throughout the battle, she knew that it wasn't something she could put off. "All right," she said, letting him in.